Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
I'm Nathan Kiker. Welcome to our podcast, Clearer Than Truth. I'm glad to be joined by my co-host, George Bogdan.
The wisdom of former Secretary of State Dean Acheson inspires our episodes. We emphasize clarity while examining the intricate global issues of today for a diverse audience.
In a world where time is limited, we distill complex ideas, making them not just comprehensible, but in Acheson's words, clearer than truth. Thanks for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. My name is Nathan Kiker, and I'm joined by my co-host, George Bogdan. Our guest today is former Ambassador Kelley Currie. Before we dive into our interview, let's take a look at the news of the day. Israel has announced it'll step up airstrikes in Syria, and in Syria, the regime of Bashar al-Assad has fallen. Assad took power after his late father 24 years ago, and his rule has been marked by genocide and instability, which has spread throughout the region. With that, let's jump into our interview.
We are hugely honored today to have Ambassador Currie with us. She's had a career that spanned 3 decades, specializing in human rights and non-traditional national security issues with a focus on the Indo-Pacific region. She's currently a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and serves on numerous boards, in addition to her work at Chi Alpha Strategies, where she's a founding partner. I want to ask, just before we get started, really, in your discussion about your recent trip, given that we have a new administration coming in, what do you think are kind of the key things that President Trump should focus on in the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, I think obviously, and first of all, thank you, Nathan and George, for having me on. It's great to be with you today and to have this opportunity to talk about these issues that I know we're all interested in, but they get, and how they end up coming at the American people can be a little interesting also, because we either see them through the mainstream media or through the new media, social media, and I think that we have so much information coming at us every day, but yet increasingly don't know what to trust in terms of that information. And I think that it's become more and more important for people to hear directly from folks who have experience on the ground in countries or from those places and can speak authentically to what is happening, and also who can speak authentically to what the United States has done and about what they think should be done. So to get to your question, China remains and I think will continue for in perpetuity, at least, or as for the foreseeable future, to be the biggest challenge that the United States faces globally. And they tend to roll things out first in the Indo-Pacific and in their neighborhood and their near abroad before they take them global. And so what we've seen the kind of, especially since just even in the past month since the election, we've seen China trying to retrench a little bit, figure out, how to deal with the return of President Trump, and especially the economic agenda that President Trump is talking about with tariffs and disruptions to global trade that China depends on for its economy and has become even more dependent on over time, instead of switching to a economic model that is less export dependent. China has become more export dependent, even as Xi Jinping has tried to establish a dual circulation economy where China is less dependent on others for technology. They remain dependent on other markets to buy the overcapacity that their manufacturing facilities are currently producing. And so they have a real problem with the fact that President Trump wants to put greater sanctions and tariffs on their goods and make it harder for them to dump those overproduced goods into the U.S. market, and use that both as a way to continue to make the United States dependent on China for certain things, which is also part of the dual circulation policy, but also may prop up the Chinese economy and continue to allow them to develop. So I think that it is really, it's going to be a challenging time for Xi Jinping and for the Chinese Communist Party. I hope it will be extremely challenging for them, because I want them to really face the reality that the United States has moved away from business as usual, and that we are serious about our economic security, that we are serious about protecting America's manufacturing capabilities, and especially our defense industrial base, which is what allows us to project strength and secure the well-being of the American people. And so I think that this is a good thing that they are worried and nervous. But in the short term, it means that they are going to continue to do things to test the United States, to test our will, to test our commitment to our allies in the region. Whether it's the continued increase of salami slicing tactics in the South China Sea, harassing Philippine ships and fishermen, having the Russians sail submarines through the Philippines' territorial waters and exclusive economic zone, increasing crossing of the midline between mainland China and Taiwan, and more flyovers and more aggressive activities against Taiwan in their airspace and economically in the information space, as well as continuing to try to preset red lines for President Trump, which is something that Xi Jinping tried to do in his last meeting with President Biden, and to say these are our red lines, and to try to box President Trump in. I don't think it will work. President Trump doesn't like to be boxed in, as anybody who's ever dealt with him will know. And but he does respect Xi Jinping as a tough negotiator, and knows that that he's not messing around, that this is not amateur hour. So I think that we are going to be in for a rough ride, and everybody needs to buckle up and get ready for that, because it's going to be challenging. I think also the other thing that's going on in the Indo-Pacific right now that is very worrying to me is that we've gone from having a pretty positive trajectory on Japan and South Korea improving their relationships with one another as part of a trilateral relationship with the United States, to a situation where the president of South Korea, in a very bizarre move that was driven purely by domestic politics, in South Korea, declared martial law last week for a few hours, and then was immediately rebuffed not only by the opposition but by his own party, and is now in danger of being impeached, is facing pressure from within his own party to step down. And President Yoon had been a leading force in pushing for rapprochement between South Korea and Japan, which is politically difficult for any South Korean leader, but was supported in that by the United States. It's been a long-term goal of the United States to try to improve relationships with our two key allies in Northeast Asia. And so that comes as a real blow to our strategic posture in the region, to have a setback there on South Korea and potentially face a left-wing government in South Korea that will be very difficult for any American government to deal with, and especially for a conservative and peace through strength kind of government like the one that President Trump is expected to put into place. So it's going to be, the region remains so dynamic as always, but the events and the relationship between the United States and China will continue to be the key drivers of events and the overall trajectory of the region. But each country in the region has the potential to impact things in unpredictable ways.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that. I focus a lot on Europe, and in Europe, there's this kind of really thick kind of institutional arrangement between governments, and we have the whole EU and all of that. But in Asia, there's not that, and there's not that kind of legacy for so many different reasons. But for a new American government trying to coordinate and develop a kind of united set of kind of governments to help us further the policies, trying to push against what China's doing. What are kind of the main issues there? Is it kind of an irresolvable tension, and is it a balancing strategy we have to pursue, or what do you think of that?
So we've been pursuing an effort. So historically, American security arrangements in Asia and in the Indo-Pacific have been modeled on a hub and spokes arrangement, where the United States was the hub and all of our allies in the region kind of related to each other through us. And for the past, I would say, since 9/11, we have really been trying, even before, but I would say for the past 20-25 years, we've really been trying to move away from this hub and spokes approach to more of a lattice work, more of what we called, I remember going back to the Bush administration, we called it the spider web. The Biden administration's preferred terminology is lattice work. But we've been trying to create a much more networked situation where our allies would work directly with each other without necessarily relying exclusively on the United States as their only security partner and the partner through which they dealt with other countries. And the Quad, AUKUS, some of these other arrangements that have come into being in the region, and the Squad, and some of these other kind of mini-lateral arrangements that we've been working up towards over the past couple of decades are pointing in that direction, but they are, as you point out, still very institutionally underdeveloped. We don't have the same kind of thick web of institutions in Asia that we do in Europe. Our partners, we don't have a NATO in Asia. We don't have anything like it. The closest, the largest, and I would say most active regional organization is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and it is a weak organization. It has zero security component. They actively avoid involvement in political issues and have a policy from the beginning of non-interference in each other's internal affairs, and that translates into an inability to work on regional political problems. And it is limited to the 10 countries of Southeast Asia. Within ASEAN, you have a lot of diversity and a lot of different aspirations and capabilities. And so I think that it is, and because it is institutionally very weak, then you have economic arrangements that the United States is not part of that are dominating in the region, whether it's what started out as TPP, but is now continuing to develop into a regional trade organization that doesn't have the kind of, it's just a trading bloc. It's really just a trade agreement. It's not so much the kind of economic union and economic cooperation arrangement even that APEC represents in the region, which is a pretty low bar. And then you have RCEP, which is the Chinese-led economic framework. And so you have all these very incomplete and somewhat weak and very, I would say, unlikely regimes that are very unlikely to develop into anything particularly useful from a U.S. standpoint. And so we've resolved to work through these mini-lateral arrangements to try to address specific security and economic issues. I think you'll see, again, with this incoming administration, you're going to see a continued resistance to any kind of large-scale trading arrangements, maybe some bilateral engagement and more bilateral agreements, but no big, you're going to see continued erosion, in fact, of the multilateral trading system under President Trump 2.0, and a reluctance to provide expanded security guarantees, I think, is probably on the table as well, as long as the incoming administration feels like partners are not pulling their weight and are not doing sufficient things to purchase U.S. military equipment, to spend enough of their own per capita, their own GDP, to secure their own defense. And so I think that it's going to, the lack of these kind of mediating and balancing and ballast institutions is it's not necessarily fatal, but it does make certain things more challenging. And I think also how the new Trump administration deals with those institutions in Europe, specifically with NATO, also has an effect on our relationships with countries in the Indo-Pacific, because if they see the United States walking away from a 75, 80-year-old alliance that has served our interests for decades, and we've decided it's no longer useful for us, I think that it is going to cause our treaty allies in the region and our other partners in the region to become much more likely to hedge and to look for other alternatives to partnership with the United States to secure their own interests.
I want to continue diving into your views on what we should expect from the second Trump administration and what you hope will happen. But I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about your views on President Biden's approach to the region. A loaded question, but I figure if anyone had an opinion, it's you. I was going to preface this by saying what you think he did right and wrong, but let's just say what he did wrong. Looking back, now that the 4 years are up, what should he have done differently? And what failings do you think will have the largest implication for the future administration?
Well, I mean, if you look at the entirety of the Indo-Pacific, the biggest mistake was the manner in which the Biden administration withdrew from Afghanistan. There's just no question that that catastrophic, disastrous withdrawal in the first 9 months of his administration sent a message of weakness, of unreliability, of inconstancy, of incompetence, um, and so and that we did not have leadership that was either strong or capable, and I think that has had catastrophic consequences for all of our security postures around the world. I draw a direct line between the failure of that withdrawal and how badly it was done to Putin's thoughts and calculations about when and how to invade, to launch the full scale invasion of Ukraine. I also draw a direct line between that and certain, behaviors that China has engaged in with regard to treaty allies of the United States, such as the Philippines. And I also think that Iran noticed that the United States was weak and didn't, and handled that situation very badly. And then it raised questions about whether we would come to Israel's to back our Israeli allies. So I see that as a huge inflection point where I certainly, because I love my country, I am a deeply patriotic person, and I want the American president to succeed regardless of parties. Because if the American president is being successful, especially overseas, then it means America is being successful overseas and is well respected and secures our country. But after that, I think there was no recovery, and I don't think I don't even think that the Biden administration understood how catastrophic that was. If they did, they would have fired people who were responsible. And no one lost their job over that. And so I think, again, that sent a signal to both our allies and our adversaries about what it meant to partner with the United States. That was unmistakable in my view. So I have to start with that. I think also you had a very confused and muddled China policy, especially during the first 2 years of the administration. There was a lot of tough talk, a lot of continuity from the things that we did in the Trump administration that I thought were very good and strong on China, but then also a lot of mixed messaging. I think that also coming out and saying that we are going to put human rights and democracy at the center of our foreign policy, and then failing to do that in any way, in any way, it was just, you can't. Look, I would prefer, and I'm a human rights lawyer by training. I've been working in the human rights and democracy field for 3 decades. I would prefer for presidents to say nothing about human rights and democracy and then do, little things, than to come out and make these big grandiose statements and then, not do anything at all. It's really devastating to people around the world who look to us for strength and support on these issues, to have that rug pulled out from under them. So I'm a big believer, especially at this point in my life, in lowering expectations and exceeding them rather than doing the opposite. But Biden, you come in and you say you're the adults in the room and America's back, and then you do what they did. I don't see how you square any of it. So I think that's, I could go on. I think this is only a 1 hour conversation. So I think we might want to move to the next question, because I could literally talk about this for days.
Well, I mean, we were both fascinated to look at your testimony earlier this year about kind of internal human rights questions in China, specifically on the Uyghur, genocide. Some call it, of what's taking place. And so I wonder, where do you think that's going to head in the next couple of years, and what can be done, what should be done? Are there mechanisms that should be in place that aren't in place, that the United States government should be following?
Well, we actually have some great mechanisms in place, and Senator Marco Rubio, when in the Senate, was one of the leaders in terms of putting some of these key mechanisms in place that we have to try to change the trajectory of China's behavior in terms of the genocide of the Uyghur and other Turkic Muslim people, and I would put at the top of that the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which was passed and signed into law in 2021. Again, reluctantly by the Biden administration, they resisted doing it. President Biden was, trying to kill the bill, right, and his team at the State Department were trying to kill the bill right up until the last minute, until he was embarrassed by a member of his own party and the Washington Post, basically, calling him out for this. And they had to do an about face and sign the bill. So and then they barely implemented it. They've really slow rolled the implementation. They've failed to use other tools that are available, such as global Magnitsky sanctions. They've failed to fully implement global Magnitsky listings that the Trump administration put in place during 2019 and 2020, where we started to sanction individuals and entities within the Chinese party state to target those who were perpetrating this genocide, even before we had identified it as a genocide. We were sanctioning entities such as the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, which is the largest economic, and it's a strange beast of a combination of economic and paramilitary institution that is literally explicitly created as a settler colonial project to colonize Xinjiang and exploit the resources there. And it is fully integrated into the into the Chinese economy, not just in Xinjiang, but in the Uyghur region, but in the whole country, because it owns thousands of enterprises that have subsidiaries and owns shares in companies all over China. It's a huge thing. We sanctioned this entity during the Trump administration, and the Biden administration has done absolutely nothing to enforce those sanctions. And so it's really frustrating to me. I hope, and I encourage people who are part of the economic team who are looking for non-tariff measures that can be immediately put into place as in addition that are already on the books, things that we have, like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, like the designations of these enterprises and entities inside China, to first and foremost protect the United States from importing products that are made with forced labor. Forced labor is endemic in this Uyghur region. It is an intentional policy of the Chinese Communist Party to use forced labor to pacify this region and to profit from their repression, much as the Nazis used forced labor in the camps in the early, before they turned them into death camps. These were labor camps. And factories that were adjacent to the labor camps. I just visited Auschwitz last week, and the parallels between the thinking about what they were doing, what the Nazis were doing at Auschwitz and Birkenau, to how the Chinese how they conduct their forced labor operations in the Uyghur region are unmissable. They have always been, but it just really hit me when I was there. Also, the kinds of forced sterilization and genetic and medical testing that they were doing on the Jews and others who were brought to Auschwitz. The Chinese have been doing the same thing with the Uyghur people, harvesting their organs, using genetic testing on them to try to build databases in order to create surveillance models that are specific to the Uyghur population. It's horrific. It is a genocide. There is no question in my mind. Mass forced sterilization, theft of children. It's all happening. It's still happening, and nobody wants to talk about it. So I think that, but thinking again from one of the main ways that the Trump administration is concerned about, Chinese goods and coming into our economy and destroying our manufacturing base, the fact that they're able to use forced labor and slave labor to undercut us and regulatory arbitrage by having heavy polluting industries that are operating in a basically unregulated way in the Uyghur region, it's a huge problem. It's a huge market distortion, even if you don't care about the human rights. So I'm not just, I care about the human rights, but I'm not limiting my conversations to people about this. So I think that there are huge economic security implications as well. And they are growing. If you look at the way that China is moving processing of certain goods and services to this region.
You had said earlier that it was a mistake for President Biden to make human rights a central focus of his foreign policy.
No. I said it was a mistake for him to say it was a central focus and then do nothing. That is different. That is not, that's not making it. It's faking it.
Fair. I guess my question would be, we saw in Trump's first administration, after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, he didn't distance himself from the Saudis. If anything, pulled himself closer. And that paid off with the Abraham Accords and other advancements in the region. But it did make it very clear that President Trump and his administration was more focused on sort of bigger picture things, and that human rights, many people thought, were seen as an afterthought. Do you think that he can prioritize human rights while also pursuing a deepening relationship with Saudi Arabia and Israel and other players in the region? Or do you think it could take a backseat like it seemed to after the murder of Khashoggi?
So again, I've been working on human rights for 30 years in Washington and around the world in various countries. And I would rather have a president who comes out and says exactly what he intends to do, is very straightforward, that and is not going to pretend to care about things that he doesn't really intend to prioritize. And then at least people know where they stand. but I don't actually think that, I think that the characterization my experience was that President Trump actually, in a funny way, he highlights the hypocrisy about when we talk about human rights and democracy promotion in a certain way, and then we continue to have a treaty alliance and a security relationship with a country like Saudi Arabia that does not have a good human rights record and is definitely not a democracy. And I think that he's he's not going to. But what the way that he treated and the way he has engaged with Saudi Arabia ended up being, I think, no different than the way that any other American president has engaged with Saudi Arabia since we started engaging with Saudi Arabia. So you get what you get, I think, with President Trump, and at least you know what you're going to get, and you don't have some false hope and expectation that's going to be um, dashed. I think he also recognizes that there are other ways to do things other than just than the traditional giving a speech and saying how much we care about something. Look, I will tell you this. Um, one of our biggest problems when it comes to human rights diplomacy as a nation historically is that there is always this massive delta between what we say we believe in and when it comes to human rights and how we then act on the ground in a given country. And that creates a lot of cynicism when it comes to our human rights diplomacy. So I think that to the degree that there is that delta, I would prefer that we close it by improving it the way that we actually act on the ground rather than upping our rhetoric. Or I would like to see us reduce that delta. Um, but I think that it takes both things. I think we do need to be more modest and thoughtful in the way that we talk about human rights in the world. I think we especially need to pare back, in a sense, what we are talking about to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to the foundational principles of human rights, and stop pushing more esoteric aspects of human rights discourse that have become quite um, quite aggressively part of the human rights lexicon recently. I think we need to get back to the idea that our human rights diplomacy and our human rights discourse is grounded in individual liberty and individual freedom, and in the identification of the individual as the holder of rights rather than government to government. That we are looking at that, and that we take in that way a kind of a different approach than what we're doing, because what we've been doing since the 70s I don't think has worked all that well. And so I am open to looking at the problems of our human rights diplomacy, of the institutions that we've invested in on human rights, and including, I serve on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, and I am constantly questioning what we're doing, why we are spending more money now than we've ever spent as a U.S. government on democracy promotion overseas, and yet the outcomes just keep getting worse and worse every year. Like, this is a question that I really think we need to sit down and understand. Part of it is because our adversaries have become much more skilled at pushing back on these things, but part of it is maybe because the ways that we're doing this are just not very effective, and they don't really meet the moment that we're in right now. So I think we should have more humility about these things. I think we should be very proud of the fact that we do aspire toward a higher, we do have these aspirations, and that our human rights discussions are aspirational for ourselves as well as for everyone else. And that we need to focus on individuals and think about the rights of individuals and how it's better for societies to have individuals who have rights that they can hold and are respected, and that this ultimately leads to better outcomes for societies. And think about the discourse in a different way. But I think that we've gotten way off track way off track with our human rights diplomacy, and we need to really sit down and rethink a lot of how we do this.
That really resonates with me. I just sort of visited President Carter's presidential center, and of course, he created the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the Department of State, and everyone's talking about now, getting rid of the Department of Education. This was this huge, proposal by President Trump, and what this new entity that he's creating to lead, kind of try to rein in government excesses. But I do wonder sometimes why there's this, when we're dealing with human rights, a desire to kind of create more bureaucracy for the government to deal with. Whereas, some might say that most human rights abuses kind of stem from an over proliferation of government entities and their tendency to use, the powers of the state in unfortunate ways. So, big philosophical questions that I hope, the American people start asking, because, why under President Obama did we reach this apex of over 70, special envoys for specific things, and then see, in those specific areas, as you mentioned, kind of big problems. But, speaking of
and you also have Barack Obama out there setting red lines. I mean, going back to Syria and the collapse of the Assad regime this past week, this is another classic case of this, where Barack Obama sets a red line in Syria on Assad, and then just walks away from it. And, as a result, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people died in that war, because, I mean, not just because of Barack Obama. I mean, the blame goes to the feet of Assad, Iran, and Russia as well. But, the role, the shameful role that he played in this. And again, nobody seems to, it's been discussed a little bit in some of the conversations I've been in, but and I do hope that the media will remember that the only person who really punished Assad for human rights violations of using chemical weapons against his own people, the only president who did that was Donald J. Trump.
Speaking of Syria, obviously we saw in the last week that the Assad regime fell after his father was in office, and then he was in office for 24 years, and President Trump said that this is not our fight. What do you think we can anticipate coming out of Syria over the next several years? I know it's early, but I'm curious if you have any analysis on what's happening on the ground. And to be frank, is the incoming government a radical Islamist government similar to ISIS or AQI?
Well, there is no incoming government right now. You have rebel groups that have a very spotty, to put it mildly, history, who have, evolved out of Al Qaeda, who have roots in jihadist and Islamist movements. The biggest beneficiary of the situation, as far as I can tell right now, is Turkey, which helped to back and train and arm these groups, and now has the whip hand on how this situation is going to turn out. This is not great, because the government in Turkey is not a beneficent government. It is also Islamist. Erdogan is an elected Islamist. He's straight Muslim Brotherhood. I think that this is going to be a real challenge for us. Not to mention the fact that that Turkey is a NATO member and a treaty ally of the United States. So it's really complicated. We have been at cross purposes with Turkey in northeast Syria for over a decade. And we also, again, one thing that I have not seen nearly enough talk about is the fact that, after President Trump and the United States dismantled ISIS, and we defeated ISIS, and Barghouti, their last stronghold in northeast Syria, fell, and the Kurds and other forces in northeast Syria took custody of 90,000 ISIS members and their families and children, mostly women and children, who have been in just unbelievably squalid camps in northeast Syria that are very badly run, because the Peshmerga and the Kurds and the SDF don't have the resources to run a 90,000 person prison and take excellent care and provide it's not, we're talking about northeast Syria in a war zone where they're fighting various people, whether it's the Assad regime or the Turkish backed forces that have been attacking them. So you have a very unstable situation there. Right now, the groups are trying to figure out if they can all work together. The US backed groups have been given safe passage by various actors that are in control of territory. There is, and you do have, I think, a demand from the Syrian people. You have to remember how all of this started. It was a bunch of, youths standing up and against the regime and protesting against the regime, and then being tortured and disappeared into the Syrian prison system, and their parents coming out to protest about it. This whole thing started, the Syrian civil war started as a democratic, peaceful protest. As a peaceful protest over human rights abuses. And it turned into this just horrific meat grinder of a situation that has been destabilizing not just the Middle East, but Europe for 15 years now, 12 years, sorry. So there, I want to be optimistic, but I think we have to be realistic that Syria is you have a lot of different power holders. You have a lot of different groups that are at very different, have very different agendas. You have substantial minority populations that are Christian minorities, Alawites, Druze, even a Jewish community that will be not feeling very secure under a Islamist run state. And so I think we have to keep a really, really careful eye. You have the Israelis trying to secure the Golan and make sure that weapons that were under the control of the Syrian armed forces do not fall into the hands of jihadists and extremists who would then use them against Israel or other states in the region or even beyond. So you have, it's going to be a mess for a while. I think we can look at how messy Libya got after Gaddafi fell, how messy Iraq was after Saddam fell. I mean, these were brutal, horrible dictators who did horrible, horrible things, and they kept these countries together by force and violence and evil. But when that force and violence and evil was released, you're not going to have a Jeffersonian democracy emerge from that context. That's just not going to happen. So we have to be prepared for a high degree of violence, a high degree of chaos, and a high degree of uncertainty and instability. I think that we are best to let our regional partners try to find ways to deal with this. But I think with Turkey being one of them, it's going to be really, really difficult because they have designs on Syrian territory and they have a lot of, and Erdogan is a dangerous ideologue.
Right. I mean, that, I think goes back even to the days when, the Turks would talk about how they'd been, cheated out of Iskender and these sort of pockets of land that,
Correct.
But for there being,
and these are the oil producing regions of Syria too. It's important to note.
Right.
I mean, there's a reason that there's a reason that the United States still has 900 troops in Syria. Part of it is counterterrorism, and part of it is trying to keep those oil producing regions from falling into the hands of either the Syrian regime or other bad actors. So it's a really, really big mess, but it's going to, we'll see. The UN has been completely ineffective, obviously, in dealing with it. And Russia hasn't left. They have not left. They're still there.
Right. Well, I mean, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about Ukraine, especially because it sounds like you just got back from there. So, we would love to hear your thoughts kind of generally about any observations you have. We don't want to take too much of your time, but if you think that there's anything important that our listeners should know about kind of the prospects for the conflict, given the incoming administration. I know that Nathan and I have both been so impressed by President Trump's decisions about who to appoint for national security position, just given that people had made all sorts of assumptions about what he would do in that conflict. So, we'd love to hear.
Well, I don't have any particular insight on the Trump side, but I can tell you that in Ukraine, they are actually quite hopeful about President Trump's election. They've been very frustrated, again, with the weakness of the Biden administration. The Biden administration has given them just enough not to lose the war, but not enough to win. They've put handcuffs on them and made it very difficult. And the other thing that the Biden administration has never done is gone to the American people and sold and explained to the American people why this is important and why it is important to the American people, why it is important to American security, what we are doing, in Ukraine, and what that commitment means. And we also have a huge problem with the fact that several of our NATO allies continue to fail to meet any kind of serious levels of support. And I'm particularly looking at our German friends who remain hopelessly dependent on and hopelessly naive, or at least, or something, maybe naive is the nice word for it, about Russia and how to deal with Putin. I think that we saw in the first Trump administration that President Trump doesn't, he's not going to put up with this kind of behavior from our allies. These are wealthy countries. They can afford this. They need to be cleaning up their own messes, and they need to take care of their own neighborhood more effectively instead of just expecting the United States to come in and clean up the mess for them. That is not okay. So we are, I think, going to see more tough love, I hope, from President Trump on that. And I think that there is a definite expectation from the Ukrainians that I spoke with and met with that will happen, and I hope that will happen because they are deeply frustrated. They just want to be allowed to win this war. They want to, but they also know that, I think they're also exhausted. They're losing people. They're losing a generation of men. And they are, children are being stolen. It's horrific. And people are exhausted. They are concerned about, the effects of martial law on their, on the health of Ukrainian democracy, and they want to see steps taken to deal with some of those challenges that are, again, it's hard to have an election in the middle of a war, but the United States, even when we had martial law and even when we were in a state of emergency during the Civil War, we had elections here. And so I think that we need to think about, working how we can explain to the American people what needs to be done, give the Ukrainians the tools that they need to fight back, effectively implement the sanctions regimes that have been very bad. They've been so leaky. Put secondary sanctions on the Chinese, and especially the Ukrainians know that this is the other thing. The Europeans have been very dishonest and very secretive about the role that China has played in propping up the Russian economy and Russia's war machine. And they have not, especially Germany and others, wanted to talk about that. And it's, this is, and the Biden administration has not really been very forthcoming about that. Only recently have they started to even really discuss it. So I think that we, as the new team gets more briefed up about these things, and you have some people who come in already pretty well briefed, I think that, we of course need to remain very strategic about how we are supporting Ukraine, but I think, and we need to make it clear that Putin can't just get away with invading a sovereign country. Like, that can't be the norm that we establish out of all of this. But I think that they're hopeful that there's now a possibility for some kind of just and lasting peace that will provide the Ukrainian people with the security guarantees that are meaningful for them. So but a lot of things have to fall into place, including a adjustment of attitude on the part of our European allies in particular, who need to step up and need to show some willingness to step up here to make things happen.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate the time that you've taken with us today. And I think, we've learned a lot, and our listeners are going to learn a lot. So we're so thankful, and we want to wish you a happy holiday season as well.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to share with your friends and tune in next time.